7 men looked at Cora and saw a liability. 7 men saw the twisted line of her left leg, the quiet defiance in her jaw, and walked away. Out here, a woman was meant to be sturdy stock, pliant and whole. Cora was neither. The town of Oakhaven waited for her to starve or surrender to the brothel, but they didn't count on a man who lived where the air froze in your lungs, a man who preferred broken things. Amos Gentry spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dust. It landed an inch from the tip of Cora's worn leather boot. "It ain't personal, Miss Cora," Gentry said, not looking at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the Colorado sun was baking the last of the moisture out of his stunted corn crop. "But I need a woman who can walk behind a plow. I need someone who can carry 2 buckets of water up from the creek without stopping to catch her breath. You got a good spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit don't haul water." Cora stood on the warped wooden boards of Gentry's porch. She shifted her weight, leaning heavily onto the shaved hickory crutch tucked under her left arm. The dull, familiar ache in her hip flared, a grinding reminder of the wagon wheel that had shattered her femur 3 years ago, and the drunken trail doctor who had set it crooked. "I washed your clothes, Amos," Cora said. Her voice was flat. She didn't beg. Begging was for dogs and fools. "I baked your bread. I kept this house cleaner than your late wife ever did, God rest her." "You did," Gentry agreed, finally glancing at her. His eyes were hard, pragmatic. The frontier didn't breed sentiment, it bred survival. "And it took you twice as long as a whole woman. I'm sending you back to town." He handed her a small canvas sack. It contained 2 spare dresses, a comb, a tin mirror, and a Bible that had belonged to a mother she buried in Nebraska. It was everything she owned in the world. Cora didn't say another word. She took the sack, looping the drawstring around her wrist, and turned. The walk back to Oakhaven was 3 miles, 3 miles of rutted dirt road, baked hard as iron in the late summer heat. Every step was a calculated movement. Right foot forward, plant the crutch, swing the ruined left leg. A jagged, uneven rhythm. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Gentry was the 7th. The first had been a widower with 6 feral children. He wanted a maid he didn't have to pay. Cora had lasted 2 weeks before he caught her resting her leg against a chair and decided she was lazy. The second was a miner who drank his wages and wanted a punching bag. Cora broke his nose with a cast-iron skillet and walked out. The third was a preacher who saw her deformity as a mark of sin and wanted to pray the limp out of her. When God didn't answer his desperate shouting, he cast her out. 4 others followed. Farmers, a blacksmith, a failed rancher. They all looked at her the same way a man looks at a horse, with a bowed tendon. Too much risk. Not enough return. By the time she reached the outskirts of Oakhaven, the sun was sinking, casting long, bruised shadows across the muddy main street. The town was a gash in the wilderness. False front buildings leaned against each other like exhausted drunks. The smell of raw pine, horse manure, and stale beer hung thick in the air. Cora pushed open the door to Mrs. Higgins' boarding house. The bell overhead clattered. Mrs. Higgins, a woman made entirely of sharp angles and sour expressions, looked up from a ledger. Her eyes dropped to the canvas sack in Cora's hand, then to the crutch. "Gentry sent you packing," the older woman stated. It wasn't a question. "He requires a mule. I only have 2 legs," Cora replied, dragging herself toward the narrow staircase. "Stop right there," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice like a cracking whip. She stepped out from behind her desk. "You owe me for a week's board from before Gentry took you out there. You got coin?" Cora tightened her grip on her crutch. "I will work it off. I can mend sheets. I can cook. I got a Chinese boy who cooks for half of what you eat, and my sheets are mended." I run a business, Cora, not a charity for a cripples. Mrs. Higgins crossed her arms. You got until noon tomorrow to find the money, or you're out in the street. And we both know the only place left for a woman with no money and no man in this town is the saloon, assuming they'd even take you with that leg. The cruelty wasn't malicious. It was just a fact. In Oakhaven, you either had utility or you died. Cora climbed the stairs to the cramped attic room she was temporarily allowed to occupy. The air was stifling, smelling of old dust and dry rot. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot, unlacing her left boot. Her fingers were calloused, the nails chipped. She rolled down her thick wool stocking. The leg was a mess of purple and yellow bruises from the 3-mile walk. The bone jutted at an unnatural angle near the hip. Cora stared at it. She didn't cry. Tears were water, and out here, you didn't waste water. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single copper coin. Her entire net worth. She lay back on the thin mattress, listening to the wind rattle the loose window pane. 7 men. 7 rejections. The town considered her a joke, a cautionary tale. The mail-order bride who got broken on the journey and couldn't be returned for a refund. Tomorrow she would go to the mercantile. She would offer to scrub the floors on her hands and knees. She would swallow her pride because pride didn't fill an empty belly. She closed her eyes, the throbbing in her hip sinking with the frantic beating of her heart. She was 26 years old. She felt 60. When morning broke, it brought a bitter chill. The brief, brutal autumn of the high country was settling in. Cora dressed in the dark. She pinned her dark hair up tight against her skull, ensuring not a single strand was loose. She washed her face in a basin of freezing water, the shock snapping her awake. She navigated the stairs and stepped out into the mud of Main Street. The town was already awake. Wagons churned the dirt into a thick paste. Men on horseback shouted over the din of the blacksmith's hammer. Cora ignored the stairs. She ignored the whispers from the women sweeping their porches. She made her way toward Elias Thorne's mercantile. Just as she reached the wooden boardwalk in front of the store, her crutch hit a slick patch of horse dung hidden beneath the mud. The crutch slipped outward. Cora's bad leg buckled. She fell hard, her shoulder slamming into the muck, the canvas sack flying from her hand. The mud was freezing, seeping instantly through her thin cotton dress. A few men lounging outside the saloon laughed. One of them, a ranch hand with missing teeth, shouted, "Timber!" Cora lay in the mud for a second. The humiliation burned hotter than the cold. She gritted her teeth, pushing herself up on one arm. She refused to look at them. She reached for her crutch, her fingers sinking into the freezing slime. Then the laughter stopped, cut off abruptly, as if someone had clamped a hand over the town's collective mouth. Cora grabbed her crutch and hauled herself upright, breathing heavily. She wiped a streak of mud from her cheek, her hands trembling. When she finally looked up to see what had silenced the men, she saw him. He rode a massive, ugly roan gelding that looked like it had survived a war, but the horse was nothing compared to the man. He wore a coat made of thick, uncarded wolf pelt. His face was weathered like an old saddle, a jagged white scar cutting through his dark, untrimmed beard from his left ear to his jawline. He was enormous, broad-shouldered and thick-chested, radiating a quiet, lethal stillness. He carried a Sharps buffalo rifle across his lap, and a massive hunting knife was strapped to his thigh. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and dried blood. The town of Oakhaven parted for him. No one spoke. The men who had been laughing at Cora now stared at their boots. This was Boone Halloway. He lived up on the jagged spine of the Bitterroot Ridge, a place where the snow was 10 feet deep by November, and the wolves hunted in packs of 20. He came down to Oakhaven exactly once a year to trade furs for powder, lead, salt, and coffee. 2 winters ago, a card sharp in the saloon had accused Boone of cheating. Boone hadn't argued. He had simply taken the man's hand, pinned it to the bar with his hunting knife, and walked out. Boone dismounted. He didn't hitch his horse. The beast stood perfectly still, ground-tied, glaring at a passing stray dog. Boone began unstrapping a massive bundle of pelts from a pack mule trailing behind his horse. As he hauled the furs over his shoulder, his eyes caught movement. He stopped. He looked directly at Cora. She was standing on the edge of the boardwalk, covered in mud, leaning heavily on her crutch. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were raw, but her chin was up. She didn't look away from him, even though his eyes, pale, ice-water blue, were terrifying. Boone stared at her for a long 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked into the mercantile. Cora let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She scraped the worst of the mud from her skirt with a piece of scrap wood she found near a barrel, picked up her canvas sack, and followed him inside. She needed work. She couldn't afford to be afraid of a mountain man. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the smell of coffee beans, leather, and salted pork. Elias, the mercantile owner, was nervously weighing Boone's furs on a large brass scale. "Good winter, Boone?" Elias asked, his voice overly cheerful, a thin veneer over his obvious terror. "Cold," Boone said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. It sounded like boulders grinding together. "Beaver. Fox. 6 prime wolf. I can give you $60 in trade for the lot." 80. 80 is a bit steep, Boone. The market in Denver. Boone simply rested his heavy, scarred hand on the counter. He didn't speak. He just looked at Elias. 80 it is. Elias swallowed hard, writing a figure in his ledger. "What do you need? Flour? Beans? Powder?" "Yes, and a woman." Elias stopped writing. His pen hovered over the paper. He looked up, laughing nervously. "A woman? Come on, Boone. You know I don't deal in that. If you want company, the saloon is down the street. They got fresh girls from St. Louis." "Not company," Boone said. "A wife. A woman to keep the fire from going out when I'm on the trap lines for 3 days. Someone to skin rabbits. Someone who don't talk too much." Elias wiped his forehead with a rag. "Boone, men don't just buy wives here. And no woman in her right mind is going up to Bitterroot Ridge. You live in a mud-chinked cabin at 9,000 feet. It's a death sentence for a softer creature." "I didn't ask for a soft creature," Boone said. Cora stood by the door, perfectly still. She had come in to ask for a mop and a bucket, but she listened. She watched the massive man at the counter. He wasn't looking for a parlor ornament. He was looking for a partner in survival. "Well, I can't help you," Elias said, shaking his head. "There ain't an unmarried woman in Oak Haven who'd go with you, even if you paid her weight in gold." Boone turned around. He looked past Elias, past the barrels of nails and stacks of woolen blankets, straight at the door. Straight at Cora. He walked toward her. His boots were silent on the floorboards, an eerie trait for a man his size. He stopped 2 feet away. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He blocked out the light from the window. He looked at her mud-stained dress. He looked at the shaved hickory crutch. He looked at the canvas sack in her hand. "You broke?" he asked. "My leg is," Cora answered. Her voice was steady, though her knuckles were white on the crutch. "Who broke it?" "A wagon wheel. And a bad doctor," Boone grunted. He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers gripping her jaw. He didn't do it gently, but he didn't hurt her either. He turned her head to the left, then the right, inspecting her like he was looking at a horse's teeth. Cora's instinct was to slap his hand away, but she stayed perfectly still. She needed to know what this was. He let go of her face and looked down at her leg. "Does it slow you down?" he asked. "It slows my walking," Cora said, her eyes locked on his. "It doesn't slow my hands. I can sew, cook, skin, and shoot. You shoot a rifle or a pistol? Both, assuming the sights are aligned. Boone stared at her. He saw the defiance. He saw the dirt. He saw a woman the town had discarded. I'm heading up the ridge in an hour, Boone said. Snow flies in 3 weeks. You come, you work. You keep the cabin. You preserve the meat. You don't, you freeze here. He didn't offer love. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a brutal, grueling life at the edge of the world. Cora thought of Gentry's sneer. She thought of Mrs. Higgins's ledger. She thought of the men laughing in the mud. She looked at Boone Halloway. He was terrifying, but his eyes were honest. There was no pity in them. None at all. I need boots, Cora said. These are worn through the soles, and I need a heavy coat. Boone didn't smile, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He turned back to the mercantile owner. Elias, Boone called out, take $20 off my credit. Fit her for boots and a wool coat. 10 minutes later, Cora stood in front of the town's justice of the peace. He was a balding, sweating man who had been dragged out of his breakfast by Boone. They stood in the middle of the mercantile. Elias acted as the witness. Do you, Boone Halloway, take this woman? The justice stammered. I do, Boone interrupted. And do you, Cora Miller? Take this man. I do, Cora said. Then by the power vested in me, by the territory of Colorado, you are man and wife. That'll be $2. Boone tossed a silver coin onto the barrel head. He didn't kiss her. He didn't even look at her. He picked up his sack of flour and walked out the door. Let's go, he said over his shoulder. Cora grabbed her new wool coat, tucked her crutch under her arm, and followed her husband into the cold. The journey up the Bitterroot Ridge was a vertical descent into hell. Boone had loaded the supplies onto the pack mule. He pointed to his massive roan horse. Ride. I can walk, Cora said defensively. You walk. We make 5 miles a day. Winter is coming. Ride. She didn't argue again. Getting onto the horse was an agonizing affair. Her left hip locked, sending shooting stars of pain behind her eyes. Boone didn't offer a hand. He stood back, watching her struggle, hauling herself up by the saddle horn. When she was finally seated, pale and sweating, he took the horse's lead rope and started walking. They left the timberline of Oak Haven behind within 2 hours. The trail turned sharply upward, narrowing into a treacherous, rocky path, clinging to the side of a sheer drop. The air grew thin, crisp, and painfully cold. The dense pine forests swallowed the sunlight, casting the world in a perpetual, icy twilight. For the first 4 hours, the only sound was the clatter of hooves on loose shale, the creak of saddle leather, and the wind howling through the canyons. Boone walked with a steady, ground-eating stride that never faltered. He was a machine fueled by the cold air. By mid-afternoon, the trail became too steep for the horse to carry her safely over the slick rocks. Boone stopped. He looked back at her. You walk from here. 2 miles to the plateau where we camp. Cora slid off the horse. When her bad leg hit the ground, the jolt traveled up her spine like a lightning strike. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She adjusted her crutch and nodded. The ascent was brutal. Every step required her to lift her dead weight and swing it forward against a steep incline. The mud gave way to frost-heaved rocks. Her shoulders burned from the pressure of the crutch. Her lungs burned from the altitude. Boone stayed 10 paces ahead. He never looked back. He never asked if she needed to rest. But Cora noticed something. Whenever she reached a point where her breath was tearing from her throat in ragged gasps, Boone would inexplicably pause to check a strap on the mule or inspect a broken branch on the trail. He gave her exactly 30 seconds to recover before moving on. He wasn't helping her, but he was pacing her as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. They reached a flat plateau, sheltered by a massive rock overhang. "Camp," Boone said. Cora dropped her crutch. She didn't sit. She collapsed onto a fallen log. Her leg was a pillar of white, hot agony. She was shivering violently, the sweat on her skin freezing in the mountain air. Boone ignored her. He moved efficiently, unsaddling the animals, hobbling them, and building a fire from dry deadwood he had stored under the overhang months ago. Within minutes, a small, fiercely hot fire pushed the darkness back. He unrolled a canvas tarp and tossed her a heavy woolen blanket. Then he handed her a tin plate with a block of hardtack and a piece of dried venison jerky. "Eat," he ordered. Cora took the food with shaking hands. The jerky was tough as leather, but she chewed it down, forcing her stomach to accept it. Boone sat on the opposite side of the fire. He pulled a whetstone from his pocket and began sharpening his hunting knife. The metallic shk, shk sound filled the silence. He didn't ask her about her past. He didn't ask her if she was afraid. He just worked the blade. Cora turned slightly away from the fire. She unlaced her boot and rolled down her stocking. The swelling around her knee and hip was severe. The skin was mottled black and blue, tight and angry. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hand against the inflamed joint, trying to massage the pain away. Suddenly, something heavy landed in her lap. She opened her eyes. It was a small tin round. She looked across the fire. Boone hadn't stopped sharpening his knife. "Bear grease and willow bark," he said, not looking up. "Rub it in. It burns, but it stops the swelling. You won't be able to walk tomorrow if you don't." Cora opened the tin. It smelled pungent, earthy, and medicinal. She scooped out a thick glob and began to work it into the scarred, ruined flesh of her leg. It felt like fire spreading over the skin. But within minutes, a deep, numbing heat penetrated the bone. The sharp, grinding agony dulled to a manageable throb. "Thank you," she said quietly into the darkness. Boone didn't reply. He sheathed his knife, lay back on his bedroll, pulled his hat over his eyes, and went to sleep. The next morning, they climbed higher. The air grew thinner still. Patches of snow began to appear in the shadows of the rocks. Cora's leg ached, but the bear grease had done its job. She could move. By noon, the trees broke, revealing a hidden valley surrounded by towering, snow-capped peaks. In the center of the valley, sitting near the edge of a fast-running, ice-clear stream, was a cabin. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress. The logs were massive, stripped of bark, notched deeply, and chinked with thick, hardened mud. The roof was pitched steep to shed heavy snow, and the chimney was built of heavy river stones. There were no flowers by the door, no curtains in the small, deep-set windows. It was a structure designed purely to keep the harsh world out. Boone led the animals to a small corral behind the cabin. He walked up to the heavy plank door, unlatched it, and pushed it open. He stepped aside. He looked at Cora. "Inside," he said. Cora gripped her crutch. She walked past him, stepping over the threshold into the dark, cold interior. It smelled of wood ash, old leather, and silence. Boone walked in behind her. He pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The iron latch dropped into place with a heavy, final thud, locking out the town of Oakhaven, the 7 men who had rejected her, and the life she had known. She was a mountain man's wife now, and winter was here. The first 2 weeks on the Bitterroot Ridge were a masterclass in silent suffering. Boone did not speak unless it was absolutely necessary. He operated on a brutal, unchanging schedule, governed entirely by the sun and the freezing temperatures. He was up before dawn, the heavy iron stove already radiating heat by the time Cora pulled herself from beneath her wool blankets. He left a bucket of water on the counter, the top layer already skimming with ice, and disappeared into the timberline to check his closest trap lines. He left her no instructions. He expected her to look at the cabin, see what needed doing, and do it. Cora started with the meat. Boone had brought down a late-season elk just before he descended to Oakhaven, and the carcass hung in the small, shaded smokehouse out back. The first time she walked out to it, the wind nearly knocked her flat. The ground was treacherous, a slick, uneven canvas of frozen mud and shale. Her hickory crutch slipped twice, but she caught herself against the rough bark of the smokehouse door. Inside, it smelled of hickory ash and raw flesh. She found a heavy cleaver and a set of boning knives wrapped in oiled canvas. For 3 days, Cora butchered. She cut the meat into thin, uniform strips, salting them heavily before laying them across the smoking racks. Her hands cramped. The freezing air turned her knuckles raw and cracked the skin around her fingernails. Her bad leg, forced to bear her weight on the uneven dirt floor, screamed in constant, dull agony. She did not stop. She did not weep. She worked until the blood under her nails dried brown and her shoulders shook with exhaustion. When Boone returned on the 3rd evening, smelling of pine needles and musk, he walked into the cabin and stopped. The floor was swept clean of ash and dirt. A stack of dry firewood was neatly piled next to the stove, eliminating the need to go out into the dark. The iron kettle suspended over the fire was boiling, sending the rich, heavy scent of elk stew and wild onions into the room. Boone looked at the stew. He looked at the floor. Then he looked at Cora. She was sitting on a low stool by the fire, mending a tear in one of his heavy canvas-grain sacks. She didn't look up for praise. She just pushed the heavy iron needle through the fabric, pulled the hemp thread tight, and repeated the motion. He took off his heavy wolf pelt coat and hung it on a peg. He took a tin bowl, ladled it full of stew, and sat down at the rough-hewn table. He ate quickly, methodically. "Salt is right," he muttered. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her in 3 days. "The rest of the meat is smoking," Cora replied, biting the thread and tying off a knot. "It will be cured by the weekend. But we need more wood if you want the smokehouse fire kept even." Boone grunted. The next morning, when she woke, there was a cord of wood chopped, split, and stacked directly against the smokehouse wall. They fell into a rhythm forged in iron and ice. Cora learned the subtle language of Boone Halloway. A slight narrowing of his eyes meant the wind was shifting and a storm was coming. A heavy sigh as he cleaned his rifle meant the wolves were tracking too close to the cabin. He never offered help with her leg, but she noticed the water bucket was never completely full anymore, making it lighter for her to carry. The firewood was split into smaller, more manageable pieces. The heavy iron skillets were moved from the high shelves to the low counter. He did not coddle her. He simply removed the unnecessary obstacles, leaving only the hard work she was capable of doing. In the 3rd week, the true winter arrived. It did not snow. It assaulted. The wind shrieked down the canyon like a wounded animal, rattling the heavy log walls and forcing bitter drafts through microscopic cracks in the mud chinking. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the snow fell in blinding, horizontal sheets. Boone was out on the far ridge when it hit. Cora watched the temperature drop inside the cabin. The frost crept up the inside of the window panes, thick and opaque. She knew what this meant. If the fire died, she died. If Boone got trapped out there, he died. She limped to the woodpile by the stove. It was dwindling. She needed to bring in more from the covered porch before the snow drifted too high and blocked the heavy door. She put on her heavy wool coat, tied a scarf over her nose and mouth, and grabbed her crutch. Pushing the door open took every ounce of strength in her upper body. The wind caught it, trying to rip it from its leather hinges. The cold hit her lungs like swallowed glass. She propped the door open with an anvil Boone kept inside. For 2 hours Cora worked in the blinding whiteout of the porch. She loaded her arms with split pine, braced her crutch, and dragged herself back inside, dumping the wood on the floor. Out, load, brace, drag, dump, over and over. Her leg went entirely numb. Her breath froze on her eyelashes, sealing them shut if she blinked too long. By the time she had a massive pile of wood inside, the snow had drifted halfway up the door. She kicked the anvil away and threw her weight against the heavy oak planks, slamming the door shut against the storm and dropping the iron bar into place. She collapsed on the floor, her chest heaving. The cabin was dark, illuminated only by the dull orange glow of the stove. She fed the fire until it roared, heating the small space to a stifling degree. Then she waited. She kept coffee boiling. She kept a blanket warming by the stove. She listened to the wind. For the first time since she had shattered her leg 3 years ago, Cora felt fear not for herself, but for someone else. Midnight passed. The wind did not die. Just before dawn, a heavy rhythmic thumping hit the heavy oak door. Cora scrambled up, throwing the iron bar back and hauling the door open. Boone fell inside, bringing a cascade of snow with him. He was covered in white, his beard entirely frozen into a solid block of ice, his breathing shallow and ragged. He dropped a massive bundle of furs onto the floor and collapsed to his knees. Cora didn't panic. She slammed the door shut and barred it. She knelt beside him, pulling the frozen wolf pelt coat from his shoulders. His hands were stiff, the skin pale and dangerous. "Fire," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "It's roaring," Cora said. She half-dragged, half-guided his massive frame to the chair by the stove. She wrapped the pre-warmed blanket around his shoulders. She poured boiling coffee into a tin cup, cutting it with a heavy pour of whiskey from a jug in the corner, and forced it into his shaking hands. She knelt before him, taking his frozen boots. She unlaced them with quick, precise movements, pulling them off and rubbing his icy feet with her bare hands, forcing the blood to circulate. Boone sat there, shivering violently, drinking the scalding coffee. He looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor, massaging life back into his extremities. He looked at the mountain of firewood she had hauled in alone. He didn't say thank you. Mountain men didn't have the vocabulary for gratitude. But as the shivering subsided, Boone reached out. His large, scarred hand rested on the top of Cora's head for a brief, heavy second. A silent, profound acknowledgement. She had held the line. She was blood of his blood, winter of his winter. By December, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. The snow was 8 feet deep in the valley, burying the landscape under a suffocating, brilliant white silence. The tops of the pine trees poked through the drifts like jagged spearheads. To move outside required heavy snowshoes and a sheer force of will. Boone checked his traps only twice a week now, relying on the cured meat and the root cellar to keep them alive. The cabin fever was a tangible entity, pressing against the walls, but Cora and Boone navigated the cramped quarters with a silent, choreographed grace. They knew how to step around each other. They knew how to exist without consuming the other's air. On a Tuesday, the sky was clear and bitterly cold, the sun reflecting off the snow with blinding intensity. Boone had gone out at first light to check a snare line he'd set for lynx near the jagged rocks of the western ridge. Cora was inside, rendering bear fat in a cast-iron pot to make soap, the heavy, pungent smell filling the room. The door unlatched abruptly. It didn't swing open with Boone's usual controlled force. It drifted inward. Boone stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his heavy coat. It was bundled awkwardly in his left hand, pressed tightly against his right side. His face, usually a mask of weathered bronze, was the color of old ash. Every instinct Cora had honed over years of survival snapped into focus. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask what happened. She pulled the boiling fat off the heat and grabbed her crutch. Boone stepped inside, kicking the door shut. He swayed, his massive frame suddenly looking unsteady. He dropped the coat. His right side was soaked in dark, thick crimson. It ran down his canvas trousers and pooled on the floorboards. "Shale," Boone managed to say, his voice tight with pain. Ice gave way, slid 20 yards down the scree, caught a jagged edge. Cora shoved a chair under him just before his knees buckled. He sat down hard, his breathing ragged. "Let me see," Cora said. Her voice was entirely stripped of emotion. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. She used her heavy fabric shears to cut away the blood-soaked wool of his shirt. When she peeled the fabric back, even she had to swallow hard. The gash was deep and ugly, starting just below his ribs and slicing diagonally toward his hip. It wasn't spurting. The artery was intact, but the flesh was laid open, revealing the muscle and a terrifying amount of blood. Boone looked down at it, then up at her. His pale blue eyes were lucid, but shadowed with the creeping edge of shock. "I need a needle. Silk thread. Carbolic acid from the kit," he said, his teeth grinding together. "I know," Cora said. She moved quickly. She filled a basin with boiling water from the kettle. She fetched the small wooden medical box Boone kept under the bed. She laid out a curved suture needle, a spool of thick black silk thread, and a bottle of harsh carbolic acid. She grabbed a clean linen rag. "This is going to be worse than the fall," Cora warned, holding the bottle of acid. Boone reached over with his good arm and grabbed a piece of thick saddle leather from the workbench. He clamped it between his teeth. He nodded once. Cora poured the acid onto the rag and pressed it directly into the open wound. Boone's entire body went rigid. A guttural, animalistic groan vibrated through the cabin, muffled by the leather in his mouth. The cords in his neck stood out like iron cables. His hand shot out, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table so hard the wood groaned. Cora didn't flinch, though her stomach turned at the smell of chemical burning mixed with raw blood. She wiped away the grit, the dirt, and the coagulating blood, cleaning the wound relentlessly until she could see the raw, pink edges of the muscle. "Hold still," she commanded. She threaded the needle. Her hands, which had trembled in the mud of Oak Haven months ago, were entirely steady. She had lived with pain for 3 years. She knew its geography. She pinched the edges of his torn flesh together and drove the curved needle through the tough skin. Boone squeezed his eyes shut. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the melting snow in his hair. "1," Cora counted, pulling the thread tight and tying a surgeon's knot. She moved down the gash. "Pierce, pull, tie." 2. The cabin was dead silent, except for the crackle of the fire and the ragged, heavy intake of Boone's breath. Cora sat on a low stool beside him, leaning in close. She could smell the fear sweat on him, an acrid scent beneath the pine and blood. 3. "Where did you learn to stitch like a tailor?" Boone ground out around the leather, panting heavily. It was an obvious attempt to distract himself from the agony. "I grew up on a farm in Nebraska," Cora said, her eyes never leaving the wound. She worked methodically, ensuring the tension on the thread was even. "Pigs get cut on wire. Horses tear themselves up on fences. You learn to put things back together, or you lose the animal." 4. "And the leg?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and sudden. He had never asked about the mechanics of her injury. Cora paused for half a second. She drove the needle in again. 5. "My father decided to move us west after the farm failed. Wagon wheel hit a rut, crossing a dry riverbed. I was walking alongside. The axle snapped. The wheel shattered. A heavy iron band hit my femur. 6. We were a week from the nearest settlement. We splintered it with a rifle barrel. When we finally found a doctor in a mining camp, he was drunk. He set the bone without traction. It healed, twisted. By the time I could bear weight, My father was dead of cholera, and I was stranded. She tied off the 7th knot. The wound was closed. It looked like a jagged black centipede crawling across his ribs, but the bleeding had stopped. She wiped the excess blood from his skin with a clean, damp cloth. She took a long, thick strip of cotton and wrapped it tightly around his torso, binding the wound securely. Boone spat the leather onto the floor. He sat slumped in the chair, exhausted, pale but breathing easier. He watched her as she gathered the bloody rags and washed the needle in the basin. She moved with her heavy, uneven gait, the crutch thumping against the floorboards. 7 men had looked at that gait and seen uselessness. Boone looked at it and saw a woman who had walked through hell and learned how to build a fire in the flames. They were fools, Boone said softly into the quiet room. Cora stopped washing her hands. She didn't turn around. She looked at the blood swirling in the basin water. "Who?" she asked. "The men down in the valley," Boone said. His gravelly voice was tired, but laced with a quiet, dangerous conviction. "The men who sent you away. They wanted a mule. They didn't know what to do with a wolf." Cora closed her eyes. A sudden, terrifying tightness gripped her throat. It wasn't a compliment in the traditional sense. It was the highest praise a man like Boone Halloway could offer. She dried her hands, turned around, and poured him a small glass of whiskey. She handed it to him. "Drink," she said, her voice softer than it had been since she arrived. "You need to sleep." He took the glass. His fingers brushed against hers. His skin was cold, rough as sandpaper. Her skin was warm. He held her gaze for a long moment over the rim of the glass, a shift occurring in the space between them. The contract of survival they had signed in the mercantile had just been rewritten in blood. January brought the deep freeze, the kind of cold that shattered axe handles and made the trees snap in the forest with a sound like rifle fire. Boone's side kept him confined to the cabin for 3 weeks. For a man who lived under the open sky, being caged within 4 walls was a slow torture. He paced when he could bear the pain, like a caged bear. But mostly, he sat by the fire. Cora took over the immediate duties. She chopped the wood, her technique improving daily, using the weight of the axe head rather than the strength of her arms. She hauled the water from the creek, breaking the ice with a heavy spud bar. She did not complain. She simply carried the weight he could not. To pass the interminable hours of darkness, Boone had taken to carving. He had a piece of wood he had dragged out from under the porch before the deep snow hit. It was yew wood, dense, incredibly strong, with a tight grain that made it impervious to rot and heavy impact. He worked on it for hours, his sharp carving knife stripping away thin, pale ribbons of wood. He didn't tell Cora what he was making. He kept it hidden under a canvas tarp when she swept the floors. By early February, the cabin fever was absolute. The silence was deafening. But the tension between them had changed. It was no longer the wary observation of 2 strangers trying not to cross lines. It was a dense, magnetic pull. One evening, after a dinner of salted pork and dried beans, the wind died down entirely. The silence outside was profound, heavy. Cora sat at the table, using an awl to punch new holes in her leather belt. She had lost weight. The hard labor and the lean diet had stripped away any softness she had brought from the town, leaving her lean, muscled, and hard-edged. Boone sat by the fire. He put his carving knife down. He pulled the canvas tarp back and stood up. He walked over to the table. He didn't say a word. He placed an object on the rough wood in front of her. Cora put down her awl. She stared at it. It was a crutch, but it was nothing like the crude, heavy hickory post she had been dragging around for 3 years. This crutch was a piece of art. The yew wood was sanded impossibly smooth, polished with hot beeswax until it gleamed like amber in the firelight. It was curved, ergonomically shaped to fit the exact angle of her arm and ribcage. The armrest was wide and deeply padded with soft, brain-tanned deer hide, stitched perfectly tight. The hand grip was carved to fit the natural curl of her fingers. At the very bottom, instead of a blunt wooden peg, Boone had attached a heavy iron spike, forged by a blacksmith, designed to punch through ice and grip the frozen earth securely. Cora reached out. Her fingers trembled as she traced the smooth wood. It was incredibly light, half the weight of her old crutch. She looked up at Boone. He was watching her, his pale blue eyes intense, stripped of their usual guarded distance. "Your old one is too short," Boone said, his voice rumbling low in his chest. "Makes you hunch, hurts your shoulder, and the peg is dangerous on the ice." He hadn't just watched her work. He had studied her. He had calculated the angles of her pain and engineered a solution. Out here, a man didn't buy flowers. A man ensured you didn't fall. "Try it," he ordered softly. Cora stood up. She let her old hickory crutch clatter to the floor. She took the new yew crutch and tucked it under her arm. It was perfect. The height forced her to stand fully upright, alleviating the constant, pinching ache in her lower back. The hand grip met her palm naturally. The iron spike bit firmly into the floorboard, offering absolute stability. She took a step, then another. It didn't feel like a medical device. It felt like an extension of her own body. Tears, hot and sudden, pricked the back of her eyes. She hadn't cried when Gentry threw her out. She hadn't cried when she fell in the mud. She hadn't cried when she butchered the elk until her hands bled. But she was crying now. "Boone," she whispered. Her voice cracked. He stepped closer. The immense size of him, which had terrified her on the day they met, now felt like a shield. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "You don't break, Cora," Boone said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "You just endure. But you shouldn't have to carry the whole damn mountain by yourself." He didn't wait for her to answer. He didn't ask permission. Boone stepped into her space, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, tentative thing. It was deeply desperate, rooted in months of isolation, shared pain, and profound respect. His beard scratched her skin, and he tasted of coffee and wood smoke. Cora dropped the crutch. She didn't need it. She threw both her arms around his thick neck, anchoring herself to him, kissing him back with a fierce, starved intensity. She felt the heavy thud of his heart against her chest. She felt the massive, latent strength in his arm holding her up, taking her weight effortlessly. For the first time in 3 years, Cora did not feel broken. She felt whole. She felt chosen. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily into the quiet cabin. "You're mine," Boone whispered fiercely into the darkness. "Not because I bought you, because you belong here." "I know," Cora breathed, her hands tangling in his thick hair. "I know." Outside, the ice locked the world away. But inside the cabin, the frost had finally broken. May broke the spine of the winter. It didn't arrive with gentle breezes or budding wildflowers. It came with the violent, deafening crack of river ice giving way, and the roar of meltwater tearing through the canyons. Boone's side had healed to an ugly, puckered ridge of pink flesh, but the muscle beneath it was solid iron once again. He was out by the woodpile, swinging a heavy maul, splitting the damp spring timber with rhythmic, thunderous strikes. Cora stepped out onto the porch. She wore a heavy elk hide coat she had stitched herself during the long, dark days of March, lined with soft rabbit fur. She tucked the yew wood crutch under her arm and descended the 3 wooden steps. "There's iron spike at the bottom. it cleanly into the thawing, slippery mud of the yard. She didn't falter. She didn't hesitate. She moved with a swift, predatory confidence she had never possessed in the valley. Boone paused mid-swing, resting the head of the maul on a stump. He watched her cross the yard to the smokehouse. His eyes tracked the smooth, even rhythm of her gait. There was no pity in his stare anymore. There was only the quiet, heavy pride of a man looking at an equal. "We leave for Oakhaven at dawn," Boone called out, wiping a streak of sawdust from his jaw. "Furs are cured. We need salt and coffee." Cora stopped. She looked down the trail, toward the jagged cut in the timberline that led back to the world that had thrown her away. "All right," she said. "The descent took 2 days. The trail was a treacherous slurry of mud and loose rock, but Boone's massive roan navigated it with brutal efficiency. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw Oakhaven sitting in the valley below, it looked smaller to Cora. Dingier. The false front buildings didn't look like civilization anymore. They looked like a cage. They rode down Main Street at high noon. The mud was just as deep as the day she had fallen in it, churning under the wheels of freight wagons. Men stopped and stared. Women peered out from behind the dirty glass of the boarding house. They remembered the crippled girl Amos Gentry had discarded. They remembered the desperate woman Boone Halloway had bought for $20 in trade. They expected a ghost. They expected a hollowed-out shell, broken by the high-altitude winter and the savage mountain man. Instead, Boone ground-tied his horse outside the mercantile and turned. Before he could reach up, Cora slid from the saddle. She hit the ground, the iron spike of her crutch finding purchase in the muck. She stood tall, her spine straight, her face weathered by the mountain sun and wind, her eyes sharp and hard as flint. She didn't look at the dirt. She looked right through the men who had laughed at her 6 months ago. Amos Gentry was standing on the boardwalk outside the assayer's office. He looked 10 years older. His clothes were ragged, and his shoulders were slumped under the weight of a ruined crop and a brutal winter. He saw Cora. His jaw went slack. He stepped off the boardwalk, the mud sucking at his boots. "Miss Cora," Gentry said, his voice entirely stripped of its former sneer. It was small, weak. Is that you?" Cora stopped. Boone stopped 2 paces behind her, his hand resting casually near the large hunting knife on his thigh. He didn't speak. He didn't intervene. This wasn't his reckoning. Cora looked at Gentry. She remembered the sheer terror of walking 3 miles on a broken leg. She remembered the cold copper coin in her pocket. She felt the heavy, perfect U-crutch under her arm, the solid weight of a man who actually built things instead of just using them. "It is, Amos," Cora said. Her voice was flat, carrying perfectly over the din of the street. "Aye." Gentry swallowed hard, looking at her thick coat, her healthy color, and the massive, lethal man standing behind her like a shadow. "My farm. The winter took the cattle. I ain't got anyone to help with the spring planting. The Chinese boy ran off." He was begging. He didn't have the words for it, but the desperation was rotting off him. He was looking at her hands, the hands he had called too slow. Cora didn't smile. Vengeance was a cheap, hollow thing, and the mountain had burned all the cheap things out of her. "You wanted a mule, Amos," Cora said, her voice quiet but ringing with finality. "I hope you find one." She didn't wait for his reply. She turned her back on him, pivoted on the iron spike, and walked up the steps of the mercantile. Boone watched Gentry for 1 long, terrifying second, ensuring the farmer stayed rooted in the mud. Then he followed his wife inside. An hour later, the mule was loaded with 100 pounds of salt, 50 pounds of coffee, and 20 pounds of lead. They didn't stay the night in Oakhaven. They didn't drink in the saloon or sleep in a soft bed. As the sun began to dip behind the western ridge, casting the valley in long, cold shadows, Boone and Cora turned their horses back toward the steep trail. They rode out of the mud, leaving the valley and its soft, broken men behind. They headed back up into the bitter wind and the thin air, back up the brutal, jagged spine of the world. Back home. That's a wrap on Cora and Boone's brutal, beautiful story of survival. If you loved seeing how a woman discarded by society found her true strength and an equal partner in the harshness of the high mountains, you know what to do. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who loves gritty, realistic Western romance, where actions speak louder than words. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss another deep, emotional storytelling experience. Let me know in the comments, what was your favorite moment of Cora's transformation? See you in the next one.